Hi, it's Angela with the Mount Airy Public Library. Happy July 4th weekend. Today we thought instead of a fairy tale, we would do another brief little history lesson. So Brack Llewellyn is going to share with us a little tidbit of history that most of us may not know. So thank you, Brack.
All right, gather round. Now don't worry, this is not some long, dry history lecture. This is actually pretty cool stuff. Now, in the modern military, it's not uncommon for women to serve. They're in every branch of the service: Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, the Marines as well. And there are a lot of women serving. We know some ourselves who are serving right now. You may know some as well. But it wasn't very common during the time of the American Revolution. But there were a handful of women who actually served in uniform with the Revolutionary Army. Now, usually women were confined to support roles. They were nurses, they worked behind the scenes, they did valuable work, but they didn't put on a uniform and fight, which is what the subject of our little talk today did. Her name was Deborah Sampson, S-A-M-P-S-O-N. You can look her up. She's fascinating. She was born in 1760 in the town of Plimpton, Massachusetts. Her father, when she was very young, her father was lost in a terrible accident at sea, leaving her mother with Deborah and several of her siblings. Now, it wasn't uncommon in those days for families in distress to send their kids to friends or relatives for them to live, to take some of the stress off the family. And this is exactly what happened to Deborah. She was sent to stay with a friend of her mother's for a number of years. When her mother passed away, Deborah was then sent to live with a woman named Mary Thatcher, who was an elderly widow. This was actually a good thing. Widow Thatcher taught Deborah to read, so that Deborah could read to Miss Thatcher from the Bible each night before she went to bed. So in that way she learned to read. Up until that time, a lot of women didn't get a lot of education, and this was a real advantage for Deborah. The widow, who was in her 80s, eventually passed away, and Deborah went to live with a man named Jeremiah Thomas and his family. This also turned out to be a stroke of luck. Now, Mr. Thomas didn't believe in girls going to school. Now, don't get upset, ladies. It was often common for women not to attend school in the 1700s. But his sons went to school, and they would teach Deborah. They would come home with their lessons. They would sit together, and she would learn from them. She learned history and penmanship and geography and English, and everything they were learning, she would learn. She learned so quickly and so well, as a matter of fact, that in her early 20s, she became an actual teacher. She would teach during the summer. Yes, kids went to school in the summer too. She would teach during the summer, and in the winter she worked as a weaver to make money. She was with the Thomas family this whole time as something of a servant as well. She spent 10 years there. Now, let me describe Deborah to you a little bit. She was uncommon for her time. First of all, she was taller than a lot of the men of her time. She was a good 3 inches taller, at 5 feet 9 inches tall. That's about 3 inches taller than the average man of that size, of that time. And of course, taller than almost all the women. She was strong. She was not, I guess what we'd call a tomboy. She enjoyed being outdoors and doing outdoorsy things, more so than working indoors and doing the traditional roles of women had during that time. In 1782, she joined the Massachusetts Regiment as the Revolutionary War was ramping up. Now, I've looked in several places, and I can't find why she chose to join, except perhaps she just wanted to serve. And that's the best reason of all. She dressed in men's clothing and enlisted under the name of Timothy Thayer. She remained enlisted for a time, and then she was mustered out of the service, not because she was a girl, but because of some clerical error. So she re-enlisted, this time under the name of Robert Shirtliff. I don't know where she got these names. This was her second enrollment. She was with the Massachusetts Regiment, and in a certain squad that was a squad of elite troops, very specialized troops, like we have the Navy SEALs today and the Rangers. This was what her regiment was. Their job was to protect masses of other troops on the move. They did a lot of what's known as guerrilla fighting. You may have heard the story of the Swamp Fox. This is similar to what they were doing. A lot of hit and run, a lot of really dangerous work, and also doing some surveillance and spy work for General Washington as well. She was well fitted for this. She was fast, and she was strong, and she was smart. The other soldiers around her never guessed that she was a girl. She kept to herself. She didn't say much. She just did her job and sort of minded her own business. But they did notice that she never grew a beard. Well, no, there were men that couldn't grow beards very well, so they gave her a nickname. Ironically, they called her Molly, which was a girl's name had they only known. Eventually, Deborah got wounded in action. She was shot in the leg with a musket ball. Now, I won't describe it to you in grim detail, but she didn't want to go to the doctor because she knew they'd find out she was a girl and they'd throw her out of the army, out of the active service. So she took the musket ball out of her leg on her own. It must have been a horrible experience. But she did get wounded again in the shoulder, and this time had to go to a doctor. And she thought, well, that's it. I'm finished. He'll find out I'm a woman, and that's it. But you know something? The doctor didn't do that. He was so impressed by her that he took her to his home, and his wife and his daughters cared for her until Deborah was well. Then the doctor sent her to be discharged with a general at the time. The Treaty of Paris in 1805 had been signed. We looked that up. And things were winding down in the war. So a lot of soldiers were mustering out. The doctor sent her to a general to be mustered out with a letter saying, do not punish her, do not reprimand her, treat her as you would any soldier. And indeed, she was given an honorable discharge like every other soldier. Now, after getting out of the army, she went back into private life. She gave lectures talking about her time in the service. She would do half her lecture extolling the virtues of doing woman's work at home. Then she would change into her military uniform and talk about being in the military. It must have been very fascinating. She made very little money later in her life, but she was the first woman to petition the Army and Congress for a pension. That's money given to soldiers after they've mustered out for a little bit for the rest of their lives in honor of their service. No woman had ever received one. No woman had ever petitioned for one. But she did, and it took a while, but she finally got it in 1805. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was a landmark for a woman in that time. Now, Deborah Sampson has gone down in history, at least in Massachusetts, as a true hero, a true iconic figure. In the town of Sharon, Massachusetts, you can find a statue to her outside their library, which I think is a very cool thing. There's a park named in her honor, and she has been named a town treasure for the town of Sharon, Massachusetts. She was actually a character in some TV series, a minor character, and in some films as well, and there's several books about Deborah Sampson. Well, what a marvelous thing. More than 200 years ago, long before women ever served in the armed forces here in the United States, a brave woman like Deborah Sampson stood up, defied her gender of the day, and became a true war hero, revered to this day. And that's our little history lesson for today. We wish you a happy 4th of July, and we will see you again soon.